All right, let's kick this off. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us virtually for this webinar today. I'm going to do a quick introduction to myself and my colleague here, Kelly. So my name is Mohammed Uwais. I'm founder and CEO of Core Data. Over the last 3 years, busy building our compliance analytics solution, which is now used by more than 20 pharma and device companies. Joining me today in this webinar today is Kelly Tope. Kelly holds the position of Director of Global Compliance at Zimmer Biomet, and Kelly has that unique combination of skill set. She's both a lawyer as well as a systems enthusiast. So her work in this area is extremely relevant. So I'm very excited and pleased to have her on this webinar today. So Kelly, if you want to talk a little bit about yourself to the webinar attendees as well, that would be great.
Sure, thanks for the kind introduction. As Mohammed mentioned, I'm Director of Global Compliance at Zimmer Biomet. I focus mainly on transparency, monitoring, systems data, and process improvement. I've previously held the position of Director of U.S. and Canada Compliance at Biomet, and I also did compliance operations and transparency at Biomet prior to the acquisition. Before that, as the slide mentions, I practiced healthcare law and was a consultant for Deloitte. Our structure plays well to the presentation we're doing today because we've brought our transparency and monitoring and data and systems group together as we're working to become a more data-driven organization, as well as use data to prevent compliance risk and mitigate risk. So we're doing a lot of interesting things now, and I am happy to share it with you. Thanks, Mohammed.
Thank you, Kelly. Very excited to have you on. So just to give audience context, Kelly and I presented at the same session at CBI's Global Transparency Conference last week in Philadelphia. And we had tremendous audience participation and great reviews of the session. So we figured we'll open it up to a wider audience since the conversation between transparency and compliance is relevant for a lot of folks in the organization. So let's quickly get into it. Just by way of disclaimers, this is required by legal folks, but presentation is, of course, parts of the presentation are Kelly's her own opinion and do not reflect the views of Zimmer Biomet and should not be considered any form of legal advice. So why are we today? Why are we here today? So as we grow into this space of transparency reporting with additional requirements coming from states, additional recipient types coming from the federal government, it feels that sometimes transparency teams operate in silos compared to the broader compliance umbrella. And while that drives the efficiency in terms of getting the submissions done, what it does is it prevents compliance to take advantage of this treasure trove of data that is now under compliance belt to be able to essentially create monitoring activities and plans based on the risks within the data. So in this session, we'll talk a little bit about how that can be done, how transparency data can be used to identify and mitigate risks. It also highlight the critical coordination that is required between transparency reporting and essentially the impact that has on compliance policies and procedures. So we'll talk a little bit about using both use cases as well as Kelly's personal experience in terms of how she's dealt with it, and I'll talk a little bit about how data can then be utilized. Before we get started, just compliance. I've heard compliance teams are good at following directions, so we, at least for the conference, we did provide some directions on how to vote. What we're going to do for this webinar is we're going to conduct the the votes on the webinar, so unfortunately you won't get to raise your hand, which was option C in that particular conference. So let's get started with quick audience polls, and just so that we can kind of get a sense for where you are with your compliance functions. And the first question is, does your organization utilize the compliance monitoring team to review collection of transparency data? So I'm going to launch the poll quickly, and you should start to see that come up on your screen, and you should be able to then vote. Give maybe 30 seconds and then show you the results of the poll. So quick poll, does your organization use compliance monitoring team to review collection of transparency data? Okay, I'll give maybe another 5 seconds or so. Almost all folks seems to have, 70% of the folks have voted. Okay, all right, so the results are in. I'll close the poll. And so we got 50% voting yes, 33% voting no, and 17% voting not sure. It's surprising because at the conference itself, we didn't have many not sure votes, and it was an even split between yes and no. So let's go to the, I can share the results, see if you can see that. Yes is 50%, no is 33%, and not sure is 17%. All right, we'll go to the next polling question. So the next polling question is, does your organization engage compliance monitoring to review transparency report pre and post submission? So does the monitoring team get engaged in reviewing the transparency report prior and post submission? You should be able to vote using the buttons on the screen. Looks like folks are still voting, so I'll give another 10 seconds or so. All right, a couple more seconds and then we close the poll and I'll show the results. All right, there you go. So I think there was a good split in this as well. Most people, 57% voting for yes, so your compliance monitoring teams actually look at the transparency data pre and post disclosure. Some folks stated no, and there was a few not sure in how their organizations operate. So I think that's, yes, Kelly.
Kelly, I was just going to add that perhaps they have a blended approach too, because in our organization, the compliance monitoring team does review transparency reports for countries outside the U.S., but does not in the U.S., where we have a more mature program.
Okay, makes sense. So maybe some of the not sure are either maybes or some combination of the two. So that's wonderful. And then the last question in terms of polls at the start of the webinar, does your organization have a formal process that involves utilizing transparency data to actually formulate your compliance monitoring program? So I'm going to launch that poll. You should see that on your screen now. You'll have the option to vote. Question again is there a formal process to really utilize that data in terms of using that data to formulate the compliance monitoring programs? All right, I think almost everyone has voted, so I'm going to close the poll and show you the results. So this might be a little surprising, but I think very few people said yes, whereas a huge percentage voted for no, which means that there's currently no formal process to really utilize that data for all the monitoring activities that you're going to be conducted. So I think that sets us up really well for the discussion in this session in terms of why you should consider at least some level of collaboration there and some level of utilizing the transparency data to really cater to compliance monitoring initiatives. So at this point, I'm going to pass it to Kelly to walk us through some of the use cases here in her experience.
Sure. So we talked a bit with Mohammed's polls talking about using transparency data to mitigate risks and who's looking at the data and how. And what we've found is because CMS has not issued any fines that we're aware of yet, there's less of a compliance focus perhaps on just the penalties under the Open Payments Act. But we have seen the government move to start using open payments data to enforce False Claims Act, anti-kickback statutes. So that's where we think a lot of the risk, I guess, of the exposure is in the data. And if you're in charge of a transparency organization, you may or may not fall under the compliance realm, because we have seen that some people are compliant, some are finance, some are IT. But it is important that you have somebody with a compliance background reviewing the data and looking for what might appear to be violations, or even just, from a data quality perspective. I think everybody probably does some type of data analysis to ensure that, as we'll see in the data later, they're not somebody who reports a $100,000 meal that looks like it's to one person. Because as we all know, once the data is released to the public, if you have an error in the data, once it's out there, it's out there. And even if you then go ahead and correct it, they're not going to publish the data and update the data set for another 6 months, and it's going to sit out there. So it's important just from a data quality perspective, and then knowing your data to see what federal investigators could potentially see in the data. Is, as we all know, sometimes appearance matters, and even, you do have the obligation to disclose the transactions you've made. You just want to make sure you're disclosing them correctly and that you have answers to the questions in your data, because, you could have perfectly legitimate programs that could, raise the ire. So you just want to know that ahead of time. And if you have any particular risk areas in your company that you're aware of, say you've got potential for off-label use, that's where you can use the transparency data to look at some of those things, because you do have product associated with it, and you can see which doctors' specialties are receiving payments or in-kind transactions related to a particular product or product group. So that's another example of using that data. Next slide, please. So one thing I wanted to talk about, the Insys therapeutic case. As Mohammed mentioned, we were at a conference a couple weeks ago, and this happened about a week after Insys was in the news again, as principals from Insys were found criminally liable for some of their conduct. Open payments data and Medicare Part D billing records were used by the DOJ to uncover the scheme. And there are a few things in the data that led them to inquire further. You had 2 HCPs who were speakers who received over $100,000 from Insys, and it was all food and travel, essentially, no research, which, that's another way you can dice your buckets and see what's going on. You ought to look to see if you're providing excessive meals, excessive travel, or what appears to be excessive meals or travel to an individual. And they also were able to take advantage of the Medicare Part D billing records, and the government can do this, did this with other companies, and is doing more of it. And they could see those 2 HCPs were among the top 15 prescribers of a particular drug. And the drug is an opioid, and as we'll see, in subsequent slides, I think everyone on the phone is probably aware of the opioid epidemic has prompted changes to the Open Payments Act that are upcoming, and it's something that the government is increasingly focused on as the opioid epidemic, continues to be a scourge for the country, essentially. And this is where you get into your false claims, because looking, of course, at Medicare Part D billing means you have the government as a payer, and they could see that the government paid $1.2 million to $1.4 million in those prescriptions. So it seemed odd that the company was flying doctors around and giving them meals while at the same time they were increasing their prescriptions of the drugs and were among the top 15 prescribers. Next slide, please. But there's more interesting points of the case from a compliance perspective, because not only did you see sales reps plead guilty in this, but 5 executives were found guilty recently of RICO conspiracy, fraud, wire fraud, anti-kickback, and the rationale was that they had conspired to fuel sales of the drug by bribing doctors to prescribe their products and misleading insurance payers about the need. The CEO had also pleaded guilty, and they're all facing jail time in this. And, you know, as compliance professionals, these types of cases, and business professionals in general, you know, really make us think about what we do in our involvement, you know, in any of the sort of business dealings with the company. Because if you have, you know, even an email that passes through that puts you in part of this chain, you know, you could end up criminally liable in the future. So there was a civil settlement with the state attorney general and the attorney general, and then the state of New Hampshire, because they were also in violation of the State Consumer Protection Act. Next slide. So this, you know, like I say, recently hit the news with the criminal penalties, because not only did you have the company executives, you also had doctors who were accused of taking kickbacks because they were participating in what were deemed sham speaker programs, which were actually social gatherings at high-end restaurants. There wasn't an educational component. And this is where, you know, if you look at the speaker fees to these 5 doctors, especially the ones that are over $100,000, you know, you would definitely at $308,000, you should be looking at your data. If you're paying a doctor that much per year, and, you know, obviously this is under a consulting agreement or speaking agreement, they're not part of your organization, you're wondering how they're actually having time to work even. You know, at those rates, it's going to be hard to justify that they put in the time to do the work, and those are the types of things, aggregate amounts of speaking and consulting fees, that the DOJ is looking at. If you're on a transparency team, you know, that should trigger, you know, sort of basic data analysis would find it, and you would think about the just compliance piece of it, as well as, I think, even if you have team members who just have a general sense of, you know, what's right and wrong, or what appears to be out of place, because that should just trigger common sense there. Your monitoring team, you know, could do on-site monitoring of speaker programs to ensure that this doesn't happen to your organization, to ensure that it's a legitimate gathering with a legitimate educational purpose. And obviously, they failed to do that at INSYS. And now the doctors are facing potential prison time as well. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it now to Mohammed. Mohammed's going to talk about the INSYS data and show what you could have looked at in the data and what the DOJ likely looked at in bringing that case that led to criminal penalties for both doctors and company executives.
Thank you, Kelly. So just before we get into the data side, if you, the physicians that were indicted in the last slide that Kelly mentioned, if you haven't read the indictment, I definitely urge you to go take a look. It's a 70-page court document that reads more like a fiction movie or a novel. I picked it up and I couldn't put it down. It has a lot of drama, romance, drugs. It's stuff that you cannot make up, right? And of course, this all happened for real and happened here, right in the New York area. So it's very close to where we are. But I highly recommend. It'll be an eye-opener for anyone that has worked in transparency as to the type of activities that went in to make this scheme work. So coming to the data, I guess the question we ask ourselves is, it's okay, to come back, to come out and look at something in the rear view mirror, right? They say hindsight is 20/20, and be able to pinpoint where things went wrong. But what if we were the compliance team at Insys while this was all unfolding, 2013 and 2014? Is there ways we could have detected something is going on just based on the data? And that's the pursuit that we're taking, right? Because that also gives us that area where, working in our current organizations, we could start to look at the data from that lens. Is there something going on? Can I find something? Is there something weird or funky about this data that I need to look a little bit more carefully? And because of the requirement for open payments, now we have a variety of data at our fingertips as compliance teams. We need to be able to analyze it, look at it, and see if there's things we can find, and then go back and drive our compliance policies and programs from it. So just looking at the Insys Therapeutics, if we were sitting in 2013 and 14, we could quickly identify some of our top paid physicians, and we could also see that a lot of our payments to those physicians was really in speaker fees, right? So that should start to give us at least a high risk flag automatically. And then if we did manage to combine the prescription record that come out of Medicare for Subsys, which is an Insys drug, we'll be able to see how the top prescribers also link up with the top speaker program paid by the organization. So we could create essentially a way to highlight the high risk physicians just from the data. And one thing that I want to also bring up is, while we have access to open payments, and of course the entire public has that, and Medicare Part D, which is prescription data from the government as well, the feds and the government also has access to what is called TRICARE, which is the insurance program for the armed forces. So the government has the ability to look at prescription data from the armed forces data as well. I'm sure there might be a Freedom of Information Act where we can pull this data, but just know that in prosecution, this data is potentially going to be used as well. And when we look at this data, we see that during a certain period, there were a couple of physicians, Dr. Rowan, Dr. Julie Rowan, and Dr. John Couch, that stood out in terms of their prescribing habit from the rest of the tiered physicians. And so just keeping those two names in mind, one of the ways that we approach, or at least with our customers, what we try to do is, how do we ask the question, how do you identify high-risk physicians? Suppose you're working with tens of thousands of physicians, how would you really essentially prioritize your compliance effort into those small set of physicians that you consider high risk? So one of the ways you could do this is you could plot. So on the x-axis is your spend for the doctor, and then on the y, so on the x-axis is the spend, and on the y is your prescriptions written by that physician, right? So you can do a plot, and then each dot represents a physician. So when you're looking at this plot, one of the things you're gonna, let me see if I can go back to the pointer. So we draw out these two areas of low risk, and what we call low risk on the bottom side is physicians that you're spending a lot, whether it's speaker program or other types of activities, but they're not writing many prescriptions for you. So those would be considered as low risk. And then on this column here, against the vertical axis, you have physicians that are writing a lot of prescriptions, but you don't have much spend on them, right? So they're also considered low risk. So they write these prescriptions, but you don't do much interaction from a commercial and sales perspective. What that leaves you is with this area here, which is, in my opinion, area that you could focus on from a target monitoring perspective. So this is where your high-risk physicians are, because in this area, these are physicians that write a lot of prescriptions for your drugs, and you're also doing a lot of interactions in terms of activities and payments to these physicians. And when we look at this map, we're able to spot Dr. John Couch and Dr. Julu Ruan as part of this high-risk map as well. So it's an easy way to kind of use the publicly available data and some internal data to really guide where your monitoring activities should be. As you dig a little bit deeper into the data, you have the ability then to be able to look at both the prescription and spend data. So one of the things that we look for is, for example, in this case, we're looking at Dr. Friedman, who was one of the physicians indicted. We see that across all the manufacturers, Insys Therapeutics actually spent almost 97% of the total funds received by Dr. Friedman. So Insys was a majority payer out of the entire industry, and by a long margin. The second area of risk that gets highlighted is the speaker services. So this is an area where most of the payment to this particular physician was done in the form of speaker services. So again, speaker services are a huge area of risk, and if you see a portion of your payments going there, it should create a risk flag. And then the third risk in this particular case is that the resulting prescriptions written by Dr. Friedman, and again, we're only looking at public database, right? So Medicare Part D. The resulting prescriptions, you can see that of all the prescriptions written and covered by Medicare Part D by Dr. Friedman, we see that almost 60% of them were written for Insys. So if you start to see all of these three flags go up, right? So you have a physician that your organization is paying extremely high in relationship to the entire industry, right? In this case, 97%. Second, most of your payments are going in speaker services. And third, their prescriptions patterns are also very favorable to your drug. This should cause immediate alarms and immediate actions on the compliance side to actually look at what is going on, because all three are major risk indicators. I'll pass it back to Kelly to cover some more cases before we look at some more data again shortly.
Sure, thanks, Mohammed. Our next example is Galena Biopharma, and this case originated in September 2017. Open payments data was used in this case as well to reveal kickbacks that were paid to induce doctors to prescribe a fentanyl-based drug called Abstral. And again, we're looking at another opioid. Fentanyl is another opioid. So shows us still that the DOJ is focusing here. More than 85 meals were provided to doctors and staff. And this is something on the next slide we're going to get to, or about things you can monitor for and look at. You know, if you're providing 85 meals to one practice group in a year, that's obviously more than one per week. You know, two on most weeks. That obviously, from a compliance perspective, should trigger something, and it looks like there's some sort of maintenance relationship going on instead of a legitimate educational reason for bringing food into that practice. They also paid doctors $5,000 for a speaker plus expenses to attend what they were calling an advisory board, which was planned and attended by sales reps. So you didn't have the right people from a compliance perspective at that advisory board. You didn't have the business people with a legitimate need that was identified in advance. They were essentially paid to participate in a meeting, and also food and beverage was supplied to them. Again, didn't look like an actual advisory board. They were also paying a physician-owned entity rebates up to about $92,000, and these rebates were related to the prescription of the drug, and that was, you know, the problem there. It wasn't a purchase-based legitimate rebate program. They were calling it a rebate agreement, but it was actually based on their prescribing practices. Um, so that was, another big compliance red flag. And they were also paying doctors to refer patients to a patient registry, and this was for another drug, but the registry appeared legitimate at first and was designed to collect data on patient experiences, but what the data and documentation showed as they got into the case was they were paying doctors to refer patients to this registry, and the effect was that doctors were prescribing the drug to be able to get the payment to refer patients to the registry. And that was, the drug from a clinical perspective wasn't needed necessarily, which is where you get into the False Claim Act violation again. Next slide, please. And that article was from May 2nd, so 20 days ago. It was pretty appropriate as we were presenting, but increased accountability for executives, like I alluded to in the NSYS case, is something that pharma and drug companies as well as device executives need to really keep tabs on as the prescription opioid crisis doesn't have an end in sight. With more than 200 overdose deaths in the last 2 decades, and you see every year they've been climbing, the government has an interest in trying to do everything they can to fight the epidemic, and they really are looking at the manufacturers of those drugs and looking at, you've seen Purdue Pharma get sued. They're the makers of OxyContin, and a lot of that had to do with their marketing and business practices as well. So if you're a maker of one of those drugs, I think you need to be very vigilant of what's going on from a compliance perspective with anything related to it and any payments made under it. And as I mentioned before, the opioid epidemic is even driving changes to the U.S. Open Payments Act and requiring reporting on additional individuals, including PAs and NPs who prescribe quite a few drugs. And, one of the reasons why this is supposed to be important and shed the light is a lot of times the PAs or the NPs are prescribing instead of doctors just to throw people off when they look at the data. It appears that way based on some things that the government has found. Next slide, please. So we mentioned knowing your data and engaging the monitoring team. So to bring this back together, what can you do to make sure you don't find yourself in one of these situations? These are suggestions that we do in our organization that we found helpful from a compliance perspective. You can, whether you engage your monitoring team or you have your transparency resources do this, or however you decide, it's a good idea. Monitor payments to physician-owned entities. Look at your high-dollar meals and ensure those valid educational events took place. If you don't, someone else will. As I mentioned, look for what appears to be excessive meals or travel and see if there is a connection to consulting related payments, and review those travel locations for necessity and appropriateness. And what I mean by this, we have a monitoring exercise that we do quarterly that looks at interregional travel. And for us, interregional, we're a global organization, means we're set up with the Americas, EMEA, and APAC. So do you have U.S. doctors who are regularly flying to Europe and Asia? Do they need to, vice versa? And those are your higher dollar travel expenses that can really add up fast as well. And you're always going to have some international travel, some interregional travel, but you should make sure that it's necessary and appropriate. We engage doctors from many countries around the world. So is it necessary that this person, or is there somebody in region who could have done the event? Monitor and analyze emergency speaker events, average cost per HCP. Again, he shouldn't be most likely under a consulting for training and education agreement or speaker event agreement. It would appear bad to the government if you're paying them, a particular doctor, so much that it looks like they should be your employee. If it's royalty payments, that's different. Royalty payments are earned based on past work. That's not going to affect, the DOJ is not really focusing on those for this particular reason. You know, and you might have clinical and development payments depending on how you pay them that hit the higher dollar amount, but you should really look at your speaker type events. And I know some people categorize them as speaker events. That's an option under open payments. Some use the categories presenting at a CME event or non-CME event, and some put them in general consulting. So when the DOJ or you are looking at this data, depending on how your organization chooses to categorize from a nature perspective, that can be a little more difficult to do depending on what your internal data set looks like and if you break those out further in non-reportable categories. Thinking back to the Olympus case, also look at the relationship between grants payments and other activities. You know, you want to make sure that it doesn't appear that grants payments are being paid to induce product purchases. That's something companies have gotten in trouble in the past, where the grant payment essentially just looks like a big bribe paid to use products. And also, the monitoring team can be helpful or equivalent looking for compliance with any state or country-specific caps. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass this back to Mohammed, and he's going to talk about some of the data and some of the reporting in the media.
Thank you, Kelly. So on the topic of physician meals, here's a polling question for the audience. What is the highest single physician meal transaction ever reported to CMS? I'm going to launch the poll, and just to give you context, it's a tricky poll, but hopefully we'll get some quick responses. And so one of the topics around reporting physician meals is, you know, of course, is a meal over the policy limit, and how do you ensure that you are able to look at some of those violations. So we have the results in. I'm going to just close the poll and share the results. We had almost 50% people vote for 10,000 and 50 for 100,000. And so I said it's a trick question for a reason. And when we looked at CMS data, this is what we found. This is reported last year for food and beverage. For against a single physician, $750K, and of course to protect the innocent, we've wiped out the name of the company. And the interesting part is that this transaction wasn't disputed, so it makes you wonder who actually even looks at some of the data that gets submitted. And of course, when we look at this amount, $750K, logically, this is not a meal, right? So either a transaction got misclassified, whether it's a research or a consulting assignment, or somebody fat-fingered a couple of zeros. But the point here is that having such a large transaction going in the wrong category and being available to the public could have been easily prevented. And this is just a single organization. As we looked at the data, we saw almost 100 transactions exceeding $5,000 per transaction in the food and beverage category, reported by almost 31 different companies. So this is not just a single error or a single company making the mistake. It seems like it's quite widespread, where teams are not able to review, analyze, and actually course correct the data prior to submission. And we're looking at meals spent over 5,000, which for any, you know, even for a, I guess, nice dinner with wine in south of France would be an overkill, but most organizations' limits are around $120, $150. So if we started to track from that, we would see thousands of transactions that exceed that. And this is the type of data that is now in the public domain for folks to look at, and something that's really easily preventable with minimal and rudimentary Excel skills or data analytics skills. So something to look at. And one of the ways that when we work with organizations, we try to figure out how are we going to create risk indicators. So I'm going to show you 3 different sets of risk indicators, and all of them are focused on meals, but they all achieve a slightly different things. So first risk indicator that your analytics team can easily create would be that the meal limit is violated. So let's assume your meal limits are 15 for breakfast, 20 for lunch, and 125 for dinner. When your meal limits are violated, you're going to get a report like this, where as soon as the meal limits are exceeded, you get the amounts, the date, and the rep. And one of the things you might notice very quickly is that there is 3 amounts in this set of 4, which are barely above the meal limit. But there is this amount at the end, which is exceedingly large, almost 5,000 USD, but it shows up within the same list. So it's possible that you might miss it if you're looking at it a little bit casually. So to prevent that kind of a risk, what we would then do is modify a risk indicator and really create a risk indicator that captures what we're looking for. So in this case, we're looking for meal amounts that not only exceed the limit, but exceed the limit by a very, very large margin. So we create a risk indicator that says, give me all the meal transactions where the meal limit is violated by over $100. Now notice in this case, we only get one amount back, and this is the amount that we're looking for in terms of at least the data quality and what we are going to submit. And if it's a genuine dinner, then we better have appropriate documentation. But in most, more than likely, this is either an aggregate or some sort of other issue within the system that needs to be taken care of before the data gets out in the public. So as we do these iterations of risk indicators around our data, we've done 2. Now let's look at another way to identify the same risk. And this time we, instead of focusing on the amount exceeding the limit, we focus on who's actually exceeding those limits. So we create a risk indicator that basically says, I want to understand when a rep has meal limit violated more than 5 times in a specific time period. And you have then the ability to drill in and look for reps within a certain date. So now you're getting a little bit more creative. You're not only looking at just the meal limits violated, but now you're looking at patterns of violation. Where should I focus my compliance and monitoring activities, right? Whether it's training, whether it's rep rides, how do I tailor my monitoring program to really utilize the data, which is telling me that there are certain sales reps that are more prone to these violations than others? And would that be an area where we could focus a little bit more of our energies? So those are some ways to create risk indicators on your data and drive your compliance monitoring initiatives. And of course, the topic of meal has been in the media since the very early days, from ProPublica all the way to mainstream normal media to even late night TVs have had a lot of fun with it. So I wanted to share, in the spirit of this webinar, I wanted to share from John Oliver's late night show back in 2013, sort of as a blast into the past, because I thought it was really funny and is more appropriate now than ever before. So I'm just going to share a couple of clips from this, and hopefully you will enjoy it.
GlaxoSmithKline will no longer pay for thought leaders, and the industry in general claims they're reforming. In fact, a spokeswoman for Pharma, the drug industry's trade group, has even bragged about the tough new restrictions they've put in place.
In our pharma code, we say that pharmaceutical representatives can bring an occasional meal, a modest meal, turkey sandwiches, pizza. I don't want to just focus on turkey. Maybe we could have ham sandwiches, but modest meals, not steak in a restaurant.
Oh, no. Not in a restaurant, although we'd probably allow a steak at an Outback Steakhouse because, come on, that's not a great steak. That's basically a chunk of horse meat with grill marks drawn on it with a Sharpie. So no one's getting ethical.
The federal website to see all of the perks given to physicians by pharmaceutical companies.
Now, I know what you're thinking. What, a federal website made up of a list of doctors? Hold on, let me Command T up a new tab right now. But look, this website is actually kind of fascinating. The first batch of numbers are now online, covering the last 5 months of 2013, and you can, and absolutely should, go online and look up your doctor at this address and see what you find. Maybe you'll find your doctor did a little research for a drug company, which is probably fine. Or maybe, as ProPublica did, when they looked at pharma payments, you'll find a doctor who's earned more than $1 million delivering promotional talks and consulting. Or maybe, like we did, you'll find a doctor who got food and beverages one day worth 4 cents. 4 cents. I have to know what that meal was. Because the only way a 4-cent meal makes sense is if that doctor is a mouse. That's the only way it makes sense. Wipe the Cheez-It dust off your whiskers before you prescribe me anything. The point is, there is information on this database you should know. And this should really be just the beginning. If drug companies really want to regain our trust, maybe they should let us know the effect that their money has on doctors in the only way they know how.
Have you noticed anything strange about your doctor? Does he seem happier than usual these days? Is he quick to prescribe drugs you think you might not need?
No, one more, actually.
Does his waiting room frequently feature surprisingly attractive, not sick-looking people? Well, that may be because your doctor's been taking pharmaceutical money. Pharmaceutical money takes many forms, from free lunches to speaking fees. Here's how it works. Money combines with the cash receptors in your doctor's wallet to create fast-acting financial relief. So your doctor can rest easy and enjoy life. Common side effects of doctors taking money may include chronic overprescription, unusually heavy cash flow, dependency on free samples, inflammation of confidence, affluenza, and an increased tendency to suggest off-label prescriptions, which in turn can cause heart attack, stroke, loss of feeling in arms and legs, seizures, blurred vision, grinding of the teeth, temporary deafness, total blindness, numbness, sudden bursts of rage, reduction of trust, angry erections lasting over 17 hours, and death. Ask your doctor today if he's taking pharmaceutical company money. Then ask your doctor what the money is for. Ask your doctor.
So I wanted to share that because I think the regulatory climate is a lot more severe than what we saw there, but it always makes the point in a very hilarious way. So before we get any further, if there's any questions, please do submit them in the chat window. We'll try to take them in the last few minutes of this webinar. I know we have just about 10 minutes to go, so happy to take any questions. Just on the topic of how do you really leverage transparency data for additional insights, one of the things that Kelly mentioned is looking at your speaker programs and looking at your speakers. So one of the ways you could start to use the publicly available open payments data is really to hone in on the individual payments that physicians are made by different organizations. By the way, this is all public data, so I'm not trying to pick on a specific physician or an organization, but showing you something directly from the publicly available data set. And so if we look at Dr. Richard Haddad, and he's done about 42 physician speaker program engagements for Celgene, we have the ability to look at all the other programs that he has done for the other organizations, and then we can quickly see by just looking at the open payments data, what are the average spend for each of those events, and then the minimum and then the maximum. And of course, as Kelly mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations use the nature of payment, which says compensation for not consulting and non-CME events as kind of a catch-all for everything. So there is some payments here which may not strictly be for speaker programs, but something else, whether it's consulting or some other type of service that the doctor might be utilizing. But you have the ability to be able to see the entire calendar, or essentially the entire payment portfolio of that physician. And one of the interesting questions that got asked at the conference was, if a doctor is performing that many speaking events, are they really doing any clinical work? And that's an interesting question. Another way to look at the same data is by visualizing that on a plot. So on the bottom, you see the amount of money paid per transaction, and then on the vertical axis, you see the number of times. So when we look at this dot up here, which says about 21 times this physician was paid $3,000 by Celgene. So we can quickly see and note that $3,000 must be on a rate card for a certain set of services by that physician. Same thing we can see for AbbVie. AbbVie has made 18 payments of around $22,000 to that same physician. So perhaps AbbVie has a lower rate card. Maybe the services are different, but that type of information you can get from the publicly available data set and quickly compare where you are. And granted, some of those may be not as relevant for compliance, but definitely as compliance becomes more and more of a business partner and provides value to the business, some of this information could be really useful. So I'll keep going and actually pass it back to Kelly to walk us through to the end of the webinar and to the questions.
Sure, thanks, Mohammed. So the last bullet point that we said, we're going to bring this together and figure out, how you can use this in your organization is looking at the coordination between transparency and compliance policies and procedures. And as you'll notice in my little graphic down there, I have PP&P, that's processes, policies, and procedures. Because while, data quality is important, appearance matters, we're aware of the potential legal pitfalls in the data. We need to not just understand these risks, but be able to remediate them and prevent future occurrences. And what I've noticed is the feedback loop is lacking in a lot of organizations. I first noticed this in ours, where our transparency group was finding, simple data quality problems sometimes, and they were remediating it, but because of staffing and various reasons, didn't have time to really determine the root cause and go back and change, either update policies and procedures or train individuals who are inputting data. Instead, they just kept remediating the bad data, and that's not something you want to do. Ideally, you're going to look at your data, you're going to understand it, you're going to know it, you're going to make sure the quality is good, you're going to find potential compliance problems, and then you're going to do a root cause analysis and figure out what's going on and what's causing your data to appear that way or come in if it's a quality issue that way. And then you're going to amend your processes, policies, and procedures as necessary, and then go back and monitor that in the future to ensure that you've got that smooth transition and that you're continually bettering your organization and improving your policies and procedures and just method of operations in general. Next slide, please. And I know we've got 5 minutes left. This is my last slide, and then we can get to questions. So one last, I like to give examples of possible policies and procedure changes based on the transparency data. Some organizations cap the total number or dollar for speaker events or consulting events. You could take the position that you're not comfortable with paying, say, more than $5,000 an event or more than $20,000 for speaker events per physician per calendar year. And those are just, internal numbers I'm throwing out. There's nothing in the law that says you have to do that. Those are safe numbers. I'm just giving an example. You could also cap the total number of dollars around advisory boards. That's another issue that's kind of fraught with potential compliance violations. We saw as the sales rep who provided 85 meals to one practice, you could cap the number of meals to make provided to a single organization or practice group to ensure that you're not engaging in some sort of maintenance relationship that looks like a bribery type scheme. You can also place limitations on travel and total dollars amounts that you're paying for a particular physician to travel for you per year. Another suggestion would be require additional approval for international travel. You could also analyze your utilization. You need to potentially cap the number of consultants you engage or speakers you engage to make sure it doesn't appear that you're sort of spreading the wealth and engaging people to use or prescribe your products. And another suggestion is to ensure that your vendor set up a due diligence process for identifying physician-owned entities. Physician-owned entities has been another area that the government's looked at and is fraught with potential for abuse from an anti-kickback perspective. All right, next slide. I believe that closes us out and brings us to the questions. I know we have just a few minutes left. Mohammed's going to open it up for questions. I'm also on LinkedIn if anyone has any particular questions for me and wants to send them via that manner, I'll respond to you as well.
Kelly, we have one question from our attendees. So the question is there any kind of statute of limitations where the pharma company could say, we know we did the wrong thing then, but we have now corrected our practices?
It depends on what law they have violated and if there's any sort of, DOJ generally prefers self-disclosure, and that's something that you would include when you self-disclose. You'd include any remediation that occurred since then. I mean, not knowing the case, the exact specifics, that's the only advice I can really give is that, if you have violated one of these laws and you are self-disclosing, that you include all of the remediation efforts that you undertook, and then, they essentially decide from there whether they're going to prosecute or not, or generally would offer a deferred prosecution agreement.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's the one question we had. Now we're coming to the close of the webinar. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the attendees. Thank you, Kelly, for being gracious with your time and doing this again with me. I hope everyone found value and you have some takeaways in how you can leverage your transparency data to really enhance the effectivity of your compliance program. We're always going to be available. If you have any questions, please do reach out to me directly or to Kelly. Happy to answer anything. And we want to thank you. Thank you for your time. And we're going to close this out. Thank you, Kelly.
All right. Thank you all. And Mohammed, thanks to you and your team for running this webinar effortlessly and smoothly, including with polling questions that generally trips people up. So great job.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.